to decrease so he can increase. Amen. He got to lower you so he can lift you up. Amen. So David, when he got to a place where he had now had his whole line of accomplishments lined up. He had conquered bears, and he had conquered and killed lions, and he had killed Goliath, and he went from being a shepherd boy to being an armor bearer, and then he went to being an armor bearer to being a general in the army, and then he went from being a general to an army to being exiled in the wilderness, and he went from the wilderness experience to a kingship experience. Amen. His best friend died. Amen. And David was now at a place where he realized that it was not about him, but it was about God. And so when he finally became the king that was spoken over his life, when he finally got to that place, he realized that he couldn't be king all by himself. Amen. So he set out to bring the ark into Jerusalem. And one thing, if you haven't figured it out yet, Israel never won a battle without the ark. Amen. Every time they went to battle, they took the ark with them. Amen. Because the ark represented the glory of God. The ark represented the presence of God. But it wasn't as simple as David thought. It just wasn't that simple. He went down and he mapped out the plans, and he got the ox, and he got the cart, and he got the people, and he thought he was just going to roll that cart right into Jerusalem. He thought he had it mapped out and everything was going to go without a hitch or a glitch, but the ox stumbled. The ox stumbled. Pastor, you ever been in a situation where you done mapped it out for the church and you had everything lined up, A, B, C, and 1, 2, 3, and it was seamless. And it come that time and something happened and it just, the whole thing fall apart? That's the same thing that what happened with David. He got into a situation where he just thought he was going to bring that ark and get it ready and build that temple, and the ark stumbled. First of all, his first lesson was you can't depend on nobody but God. That was his first lesson. You thought you had it figured out and you never consulted God on the matter. Amen. That is one lesson we all learn in ministry. Amen. The second thing was that since the ark represented the glory of God and the ark represents the presence of God, what we have to understand about God is unchanging in his nature. And sometimes we as saints, we get a little too comfortable with God because he's just been that good. Because he gave us a holy boldness to go before his throne anytime we want. And sometimes we just forget he's God. And God got to allow a circumstance to happen in your life so you can remember just how powerful he is. He said, I'm your God and I'm your friend, but I'm not your chum. I love you and I have mercy on you, and I inhabit you in your praise, and I will give you the desires of your heart, but I'm still running the show. Amen. And so sometimes when we get a little too comfortable with God, we forget how powerful God is. It's like fire. Fire is illuminating. Fire is bright. Fire is warm. But if you get close to fire and you don't respect fire, fire will burn you. Can I get a witness? If you are not smart and you climb up a pole with some electrical voltage on it, it don't care what you know, what you don't know. It don't care if you crawled up there by accident. If you get up there and touch them wires, you're going to get electrocuted. Amen. And so when David set out to have the ark brought into Jerusalem, he didn't think it through just that quick, because he had to go through a lesson. God wanted to show him not only was he powerful and not only was he still God, but God wanted to show him a lesson that would humble him, because God was in the process of transforming him. He had already dealt with David externally with his external matters. Now he wanted to deal with David with some internal matters. And God said, I don't want you to rely on no created strength, but I want you to rely on the uncreated strength. One thing you ought to know, Uzzah, his name means strength. And so he was trying to bring the ark on the strength of Uzzah. And God said, you ain't moving me on nobody else's strength, because I'm God and I'm going to move on my strength. And so he had an Uzzah experience. His strength had to die so God's strength can rise up in him. But David was hurt by that thing. He didn't understand because he didn't realize what God was preparing him for. He was coming to another dimension in his service to God. And what does that have to do with 25 years in ministry? What it has to do is that sometimes we get to a place, pastor and co-pastor, where we get comfortable because we've been doing the same thing for 25 years. We get comfortable with the traditions of men. And what we have to understand is God is taking you to another dimension, and it ain't going to be church as usual no more. Archbishop was here last 2 weeks ago, and he said your season is about to change. But when your season changes, that means some things around you got to change. Some oozes got to die. Because we rely on our own strength, and this is a time where God is positioning you to rely on his strength. And we can't be hurt about it. We just got to open up about it. That's why when the ark came to the gate, to the stronghold of the city, David got an epiphany. Something woke up in him. He realized that the second time around, when he did it God's way, that it was the only way. And so he had an epiphany, and he began to dance in front of the ark. His dancing represented his humility. His dancing represented that I'm not going to do it on my power, but I'm going to do it on God's power. His dancing meant that my royalty means nothing when I stand against the Lord, who is King of Kings and sits on glory from on high. Amen. He is not dependent on man's recognition. He's only dependent on what God has for him. Amen. Somebody say, what God has for me is for me. Amen. So God is very changeless in his nature. And if you approach God, we can't approach God from the position that we're looking for God to change. We have to understand when you approach God, you gonna change. God is not going to change, amen, but he's going to change you, amen. He's going to remove those things in you that he is not pleased with. He's going to remove those things that you are now have accomplished. He doesn't want you to be comfortable in your walk, but he wants you to be very uncomfortable. He doesn't want you to be comfortable in ministry, because that means you become complacent in ministry. But he wants you to be very uncomfortable because he has a greater plan for you. And so when David got to that place, when he realized this is not going to be service as usual, he said, the first time I set out on this path, he said, I did it on my own thinking, and God doesn't follow my mind. I realized that all that playing and all that serenading God and all that writing of the song was actually me responding to God. But now I got to stop and listen to him. Amen. I got to stop and rethink this thing. I got to go before the throne, and I got to do some praying. I got to take a time out. The Bible said he took a time out for 3 months, amen, because he realized that God is an all-consuming fire. He realized that there was another nature of God that he had not yet recognized. He had only knew God in his nearness, in his energies, in his move. But then he finally found out that there's a side of God that my mind can't even comprehend, in his true essence, in his